The story people like to tell about Twiggy begins with scissors. It's a tale of a teenage girl in a chair, hair falling in soft, indifferent clumps. The ordinary drama of a London salon turning somehow into a world event. But if you listen closely to what she's said in later years, the pauses, the moments where the smile tightens, you can hear the other story underneath. This was a young woman moving with the speed of the industry machine, the adult hands on the levers, the way fame can feel less like being discovered than being processed. There's a flashbulb bright comedy to it all, and then, without warning, a darker note. A young woman being tested, cornered, mocked for sport on television. A powerful man waving a gun. A life that has to grow up while the world keeps insisting it stays 16 forever. Twiggy survived it by becoming more than the look, by insisting, again and again, on being a person. Welcome to Society Mysteries. Leslie Hornby was born on the 19th of September 1949 in Neasden, northwest London, the youngest of three daughters in a tight, working-class family. Her father worked as a carpenter and joiner. Her mother was a factory worker before focusing on the home. There were no show business connections, no silver spoons, no stage mothers pushing her toward the lights. If anything, the world she grew up in valued steadiness over spectacle. The mythology of Twiggy often tries to paint her as a creature conjured fully formed from swinging London, as if the era simply breathed her out. But the raw material came from somewhere quieter, a family life with routines. A father who worked with his hands, sisters close enough to feel like a small protective weather system around her. She has spoken of that home with a kind of plain gratitude, as though the emotional temperature of her childhood, steady, decent, became the thing she would keep reaching for when the outside world grew feverish. She was small for her age, slim to the point of frailty in a culture that still admired curves. At school, she was not the obvious beauty. She has often said she never imagined modeling. It simply wasn't on the horizon. But London in the early 1960s was mutating fast. Youth wasn't just a phase anymore. It was becoming a market, a mood, a magnet. Boutiques were multiplying, hemlines were climbing, teenagers were acquiring spending power and confidence in equal measure. Leslie, like so many girls with more imagination than money, developed her taste through looking. Fashion magazines, news agents, what she could spot on the street, what she could copy and remake. She took a Saturday job in a hairdresser's, and while this was technically an apprenticeship, it also turned out to be an escape hatch. In that small, sharp-smelling world of sprays and pins and gossip, she learned how style is built out of attention and timing. And she learned something else too, the way a look can be assembled like a story. Her idols weren't marble statues. They were high street revolutionaries and boutique dream merchants. Mary Quant's liberation by hemlines, Bieber's moody glamour, Barbara Hulanicki's sense that you could drape a little theatre over your day-to-day life. Leslie absorbed those signals and translated them into her own language. DIY ingenuity, a kind of inventive thrift, the confidence to be bold without being grand. You can see, even here, the future Twiggy thing. It was not aristocratic beauty descending from above, but a girl from Neasden making herself into something brand new. By the mid-1960s, she was still working in a London salon, moving through the days with that apprentice's mixture of invisibility and hyper-awareness, watching older women become themselves in mirrors. It's in this period that the figure who would shape the early narrative steps in. His name was Justin de Villeneuve, but he was born plain old Nigel Davis. He was older than Leslie, charismatic, ambitious, and soon both her manager and romantic partner. The origin moment of Twiggy has been repeated so often it risks turning into folklore, but it actually remains pretty concrete. It came in 1966 at Leonard of Mayfair, a fashionable salon run by Leonard Lewis. Leslie agreed to have her long hair cut short. It was cropped and utterly radical for the time. Barry Latigan photographed her after the cut. The image was astonishing. Pale face, dark-lined eyes, exaggerated lower lashes drawn on like punctuation marks, hair hugging the skull. The pictures were modern and stark. A journalist, Deirdre McSharry, saw something in those images and pushed it into print with the kind of confident headline that doesn't just describe reality but manufactures it. The Daily Express called her the face of 66, and the phrase detonated like a starting pistol. Overnight is a word that flatters the public. Behind overnight, there are frantic phone calls, introductions, negotiations, a pace that doesn't ask whether a 16-year-old has the bandwidth for it. But the effect was immediate. A girl who had been a salon assistant becomes, in a matter of weeks, a face that can be reproduced endlessly. Magazine covers, photo spreads, licensing, endorsements, merchandise. Within months, she was on the covers of Vogue and Tatler, modeling for major photographers, traveling across Europe. She was 16, then 17. The pace was ferocious. The name, Twiggy, did a great deal of the work. It was originally a teasing reference to her thinness, but it became her professional name. It's a brand name disguised as a nickname, catchy and slightly mischievous. The timing was perfect in a way that can feel almost sinister. Britain was in the midst of what later writers would call a youthquake. Teenagers with disposable income, young women refusing the old rules, fashion becoming a daily form of rebellion. Twiggy didn't invent this, but she arrived as a clean, photogenic summary of it. At the center of this, de Villeneuve's role became pivotal. He had ambitions that extended beyond hair salons and test shots. He rebranded himself with a continental-sounding name, styled himself as her Svengali, and built an apparatus around her image. The relationship, in its private dimension, has been described with affection and complication. In its professional dimension, it reads as an early template for how young women in fashion could be packaged and managed by older men. In later reflections, Twiggy has spoken with a calm frankness about how certain aspects look by today's standards, a phrase that carries a lot of weight. What once passed as normal, the boyfriend manager, the control over bookings and messaging, the adult man shaping the teenage girl, now invites scrutiny. The point isn't to retrofit melodrama onto the past, it's to acknowledge that success can be built on structures that leave limited room for a young person to breathe. Nonetheless, she was the era's shorthand. Short hair, graphic lashes, a slight frame wrapped in modernity. And then the machine went global. By 1967, the story had already expanded into something recognizably modern. This was now fame as a managed spectacle. When Twiggy reached New York, it wasn't just a booking, it was a media circus. Press room briefings, crowds, airport frenzy. The girl from London was suddenly being framed as an extraterrestrial visitation. She herself would later describe the sensation in terms that suggest she felt disorientation more than conquest, as if she'd stepped into a scene that was happening to her rather than with her. The American appetite for swinging London was enormous, and Twiggy became its most exportable product, a face that could be used to sell the dream of a new decade. This is the period where modeling started to fuse with celebrity in a way that now seems inevitable but then was still novel. Twiggy wasn't just walking runways, she was doing talk shows, photo calls, public appearances that resembled political campaigning. There was money to be made not only in her image, but in its multiplication. Contemporary reporting already described an empire, which is a revealing word to apply to a teenager. Even Alexander the Great would have to make it out of his teens to be described in such a way. An empire implies governance, strategy, control. It also implies that the subject is in some sense territory. Fame also provoked its own genre of cruelty, the public insisting on access not only to her face but to her dignity. Twiggy was frequently framed as a phenomenon rather than a person, and phenomena are fair game. Her thinness was dissected publicly. Some critics accused her of promoting an unhealthy ideal. Others defended her natural build. She herself insisted she was simply slim, not starving. She also became a target for gotcha questions, tests disguised as interviews, designed to puncture the balloon of her popularity. One moment in 1967 has been revisited again and again. In one notorious segment on an American show featuring Woody Allen, the teenage Twiggy was asked about her favorite philosopher. The question was delivered with the knowing smirk of an adult expecting to expose vapid ignorance. She later described feeling humiliated, set up to look foolish. The exchange has aged as poorly as everything else related to Alan's off-screen life. What was once treated as light entertainment now reads as a powerful man mocking a young woman for not performing intellectual depth on cue. Twiggy's later recollection is telling not because it reveals scandal, but because it reveals the atmosphere, the expectation that a young model should be humiliated for entertainment as if beauty were an offense requiring punishment. All that aside, the only thing missing from this Twiggy meets Woody moment was surely Penelope Tree. And if you'd like to know more about how she branched out into the fashion world, be sure to have a look at my first ever episode, which is all about her. I don't leave anything out, I can assure you. Then there are the stories that sound like parables about power in that era. Twiggy also found herself meeting Phil Spector, and it descended to a moment in which, by her account, he started waving a gun around. With Phil, this was probably nothing personal. The list of people he pointed guns at could fill a small phone directory. But it's one of those moments that makes you picture a room going cold, everyone suddenly aware of the fragility of the social contract. Despite the frenzy and enormous pressure, Twiggy worked relentlessly. She fronted campaigns, launched merchandise lines bearing her name, and earned substantial sums. By the late 1960s, she was reported to be making hundreds of thousands of pounds, a staggering figure for someone who had recently been sweeping hair off a salon floor. The brand extended to cosmetics, clothing, even lunchboxes. She was not just modeling fashion, she was fashion and pop culture, blended into one word. The story of 1966 to 1970 is often told as a rocket arc, fast ascent, glittering peak, sudden fade, but that can make it sound like she simply vanished when the trend shifted. In reality, the more interesting part is what she did next. She walked away from the full-time teen model treadmill at a moment when staying would have been the easiest financial choice, and perhaps the hardest psychological one. The exact endpoint is sometimes dated a little differently, but the pivot is clear. She refused to be frozen in her most marketable age. In 1970, she effectively retired from full-time modeling. She was 20. The break with Villeneuve followed soon after. Their professional and romantic partnership ended, and with it the original structure that had shaped her career. Her second act began with risk. Acting, in the public imagination, is often framed as a natural progression for models. The face steps into motion, the still image becomes a character. But for Twiggy, the move carried stakes. If she failed, she would confirm the suspicion that she was nothing more than a fad with good cheekbones. If she succeeded, she would seize authorship of her own narrative. She took the gamble, and in 1971 she appeared in Ken Russell's film version of The Boyfriend. Russell was not known for delicacy. His work could be flamboyant, sharpened, sometimes brutal in its theatricality. In that context, casting Twiggy wasn't merely a celebrity stunt. It was a test of whether she could stand inside a director's vision and still project her own presence. Twiggy's performance surprised critics. She won 2 Golden Globe Awards, Most Promising Newcomer and Best Actress in a Musical or Comedy. The accolades were more than trophies. They were proof that she could inhabit roles beyond her own image. Acting required craft, rehearsal, stamina of a different kind, the willingness to fail in public. It also offered something fame had stolen from her, a measure of control over what she was communicating. Not just youth, not just look, but character and voice. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, she expanded into television, stage, and music, moving across formats as if refusing to let any single industry own her. This period is sometimes compressed in popular memory because it lacks the easy headline of Face of 66, but it's where the adult Twiggy is forged. Someone who keeps working, keeps shifting, keeps insisting on being more than the souvenir of an era. And then her personal life for a time offered what fame never could, a bit of actual privacy. In 1977, she married American actor Michael Whitney. A year later, they had a daughter. Motherhood, reshaped her priorities. The itinerant modeling life had been all travel and flashbulbs. Parenting demanded routine and presence. It seemed like a dream, but the nightmare was brewing quietly, and it wouldn't be long coming. The tragedy arrived in 1983 when Whitney died suddenly of a heart attack at 44. Widowhood in your early 30s is not the kind of reinvention anyone chooses. The loss was devastating. She has spoken of that period as one of profound grief and adjustment. Fame did not cushion the blow. It did not simplify the logistics of single parenthood. The narrative of eternal youth had no place for bereavement, yet bereavement arrived anyway. If the first half of her life is about the world trying to define her, the aftermath of this loss is about her defining herself in quieter ways. Through work, through parenting, through the slow choice to keep going without the fantasy that everything will be fine because the cameras are still interested. Later in the decade, she found love again. She married Lee Lawson in 1988 in Sag Harbor on Long Island. The timeline of when they met is sometimes reported with minor variations, but the pattern is clear. A second marriage that suggests not a return to teenage romance mythology, but an adult partnership formed after the world has already shown its teeth. There is a difference between being adored and being known. For someone who had been known by millions who knew nothing of her, that distinction matters. Her career in the years that followed doesn't conform to the neat rise and fall arc that biographical writing so often prefers. There's no definitive decline, no humiliating exile. Instead, there is something more real, cyclical reinvention. She continued acting, appeared in films through the 1980s, and became a familiar presence in entertainment culture, not as a teenage emblem, but as a working performer. She moved into presenting and television formats that allowed her to be herself on screen, not merely styled into silence. Then, in the 2000s, another twist, the return to fashion, but on her own terms. One of the most telling late career chapters is her association with Marks & Spencer. In a sense, it completes a thematic loop. The young Twiggy had represented democratized fashion, style that belonged on the street, not locked behind couture gates. Marks & Sparks is the mainstream high street made national. Her re-emergence in that world wasn't a nostalgia act, so much as a statement. The original supermodel, older now, still recognizable, still able to translate personal style into a message people could use. It was also a reminder that she had become something rarer than a trend, a face that could age publicly without losing its cultural charge. The 2000s and 2010s brought new audiences who didn't remember the airport crowds or the Face of 66 headline firsthand. Some met her through television, including a stint as a judge on America's Next Top Model, a show that, in its glossy cruelty and sincere aspiration, sometimes felt like the descendant of the same fame machine that had once swallowed her. There is a quiet irony in that. She had been the teenage subject of a new celebrity industrial complex. Decades later, she was positioned as an authority within a later version of it, offering judgment and guidance to young women stepping into the same bright hazard zone. In 2014, she appeared on the BBC genealogy series, Who Do You Think You Are?, tracing her family history. The program revealed ancestors who had lived ordinary, often difficult lives. For a woman whose public image had been so intensely modern, it was an interesting reminder that even a global icon is rooted in a lineage of sweating workers and hard strivers. By 2019, the establishment that once treated her as a fad formalized its recognition. She received a damehood in the New Year honours, becoming Dame Leslie Lawson. There's a wonderful British contradiction in that transition. The mod sprite of the 1960s, once a sign of youth revolt, later honoured by the state. In the 2020s, she has remained active, giving interviews that revisited her early fame with candour. She spoke about the pressures of being sexualized and scrutinized as a teenager, about the imbalance in her relationship with Villeneuve, about moments of humiliation and fear that had once been brushed aside. Time had altered the context. Behaviors once normalized were now interrogated. She did not rewrite history, but she did reclaim her voice within it. A documentary directed by Sadie Frost, focusing on her life and career, premiered at the BFI London Film Festival in 2024 and received wider release in 2025. The film presented archival footage alongside contemporary reflections, allowing Twiggy to narrate her own trajectory, from Neasden to New York, from model to actor to dame. It underscored the central fact that she had not been a passive mannequin, but an active participant, making decisions at crucial junctures. To cut her hair, to leave modeling, to pursue acting, to marry, to rebuild after loss. As of the mid-2020s, she has continued to appear in fashion campaigns and public events, her image transformed but recognizable. The exaggerated lashes were long gone, yet the eyes remained direct. She had outlived the decade that made her famous and the men who had tried to define her. She had built a career that extended far beyond the shorthand of Face of 66. Twiggy is not just a haircut or a hemline. She altered the visual language of fashion and accelerated the transformation of models into international celebrities and individual brands. But perhaps more importantly, she demonstrated that the story did not have to end at 19. She grew up in public and refused to remain a relic. The haircut was the beginning. The life that followed was the achievement. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this look at the ultimate 60s icon. Let me know if you remember Twiggy in her younger years, or from anything she's done since then. I've been Chester. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!